We'll start. Welcome, everyone, to the Friday seminar here at TREC. Today we have Ian Carlton from EcoNorthwest. Also does his own consulting in the area of real estate, public policy, finance, and the social impacts of all of that. So today he'll be presenting some work on equitable transit-oriented development. He has a PhD in urban planning from UC Berkeley. I'll let you take it away.
All right, thank you. And thank you for having me. Very pleased always to be at Portland State. My grandmother graduated from Portland State. My mother graduated from Portland State. So I am very happy to be here as a visiting scholar, and then even next term as an adjunct in a course. So yeah, thank you, Portland State University. The topic that I want to discuss today is one that I was invited to present on several months ago. The topic, realistic or utopian, coordinating transit and land use to achieve equitable TOD, focuses on something that seemed almost inevitable a few weeks ago. This notion that we would continue to invest in transit, we would continue to invest in equity, we would continue to invest in affordable housing. And so you'll see that the slides I prepared really are framed around this sort of inevitability and perhaps shaping what we might do in this realm. And I have to acknowledge the elephant in the room, which is that we do not know the future as well as we thought we did a few weeks ago. And perhaps even talking about equitable TOD pales in comparison to talking about people scared for their civil rights. But I will talk today about a key component of equity, which is the availability of housing in locations that are opportunity rich. This is the type of project that I'm going to be discussing today. This is Fruitvale Transit Village in Oakland, California. This project, which opened around 2000, is a project that took 10 years to build. It was a community-led effort where the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, BART, was thinking about moving or expanding a parking lot, and the community organization located nearby stepped up and said, we would like something more than a parking garage. And this is what was achieved after much struggle and considerable planning and collaboration on the part of agencies all over the country. This project includes housing, some of which is affordable. It includes ground floor retail. It includes a bike share station, underground parking, a library, a Head Start center, a clinic, a medical clinic, the nonprofit headquarters of the organization that led this community-driven work, and it's located in the heart of a Latino community in Oakland. It is sort of the poster child for equitable transit-oriented development, and in fact, a photo, not this particular one, but a photo like this one, was the cover photo for the livability initiative of the federal government, both in the transit side, and you could go to the HUD website and you would find the same project on their websites. So this is what I'm going to talk about today, is the notion of building housing near transit that provides for community needs and allows for all members of the community to have a chance to live in such locations. Now, when we talk about equitable TOD, we're also talking about the preservation of existing affordable housing, but I'll be focusing on the development of new vertical development around transit today. So 3 major messages, and I'm going to try and run through a lot in a short amount of time. The first one is that the market, our primary market system for delivering housing, does not really deliver transit-oriented development, let alone equitable transit-oriented development. And in what I will try to argue today through evidence is that it's ineffective to try to deliver equitable TOD through our common, predominant, market-based housing system without significant support, and that I'll ask this question and try to provide some insights into it. Could we modify or create new real estate development institutions that could generate more equitable TOD than we're seeing today? All right. So when we're talking about equitable TOD, we're talking about housing, transit, and everything. I'd like to know, just amongst you in the room, how many of you would identify yourselves as transportation-focused planners, for example? Okay. How about land use or housers? 0. All right. Oh, you work for HUD? Perfect. Anyone else? I want to shout out their sort of primary interest in transit-oriented development. Could be anything. All right, we'll stick with those two. Okay, so we're going to merge two worlds. I've done a lot of studies on equitable TOD for folks like HUD and for the FTA, where we put together guidebooks on how a community could figure out their current situation and what they could do to foster equitable TOD. We put together a strategy for the city of Los Angeles, their transit-oriented development strategy. And the TOD strategy here became an equitable TOD strategy as we talked to people more about the wants and needs of the community. Studies on low-income housing tax credits and their allocation geographically, and other studies for foundations and others who are facing problems where equitable TOD isn't being built at the rate, quality, quantity that they anticipated. And that's sort of across all of these projects that I've worked on, is how do we make this happen more, because we're not seeing very much of it. And that's the key sort of foundation upon which we start this conversation, is we're not seeing much of this. In fact, when I did my dissertation and I was interviewing transit planners to understand how they were planning transit to promote TOD, let alone equitable TOD, pretty much across the board, I heard that people were disappointed in the quantity of development relative to their expectations. They planned a transit project in hopes of seeing lots of TOD being built, and all across the country, no matter what market, they were not seeing as much as they had hoped for. And it's funny, when I was in LA working on TOD, and we sort of started this equitable TOD conversation, I heard this a lot, which is that we need inclusionary zoning, or the equivalent, at every one of these new stations. We're spending billions on new stations, and we need a way to make sure that affordable housing is built next to every one, because the development is just going to come like crazy. But I was there in Los Angeles because they weren't seeing much TOD being built. They had brought in consultants to help them actually generate more TOD. So this did not square with sort of why I was in the room, to help them foster more transit-oriented development. And I think that we're hamstrung by our faith in how transit is going to impact market values and real estate development. I think we just have a blind faith that when you build transit, the TOD will come. And we base that on a ton of research. We have this idea that comes out of the literature that proximity to transit stations can impact prices and land values. All right? Tons of work done on that. But I think when you dig deeper into the research, what you find is our perception of how things work. This is sort of a nice theoretical diagram by strategic economics, that we announce transit's going to be opened, and then we see sort of a rush. Land prices increase, everyone wants to build, then transit opens, and then we see more and more impacts, be they demand impacts or real estate development. Well, when you look at the data, what you find is the demand impact can be relatively small, almost insignificant. The impact of building transit next to housing can actually be negative. We have case studies. We have actual empirical evidence from studies that show close proximity to transit, because of the nuisance impacts of transit, can lead to declines in prices. We also know that there was theory, and now it's been observed, that you could have a shift in demand such that being closer to transit is more valuable, but being just a little bit further away from transit, your property values decline. Sort of a zero-sum game. Your property values decline, rents decline relative to the other locations. Also, demand can vary tremendously across a transit project. So from one end of a transit project to another, you can see very different results. You can see tremendous price increases and real estate development at one end and see nothing at the other. It's the same transit project, it was the same investment, very different locations, and that's because the markets experience the impact differently. And the other thing is that the conversation that we're having about land values doesn't necessarily translate directly to real estate development. So the impacts may be inadequate to actually influence the amount of development that occurs around a transportation project. So this faith that we have in delivering transit and therefore TOD will come, and equitable TOD needs to be included in that just doesn't square with what we know. In the study that I did for the foundations that were putting money and energy and effort into equitable TOD projects and finding that they were stalled or failed completely, we tried to come up with sort of a qualitative and then quantitative metric for why they stalled. And what we found actually, interestingly enough, is it's that variation in markets and the fact that demand doesn't necessarily always spike that was causing a lot of these equitable TOD projects to stall. And that's because so many equitable TOD projects rely on the market. So you have projects like this one where a certain percentage of the units in the building are intended to be affordable through a cross-subsidy from the market rate units. So the market rate units have to be viable enough to cross-subsidize the lower rent units in the same building. And over here you have a development where it was stymied in part because there was a requirement for ground floor retail. The community wanted ground floor retail. There was not a market for ground floor retail. So the housing that was being delivered above, heavily subsidized affordable housing, was unable to be delivered because of both the ground floor retail and the high cost of delivering parking in this project. And so subsidies had to be found to make this happen. And so I think we're also really hamstrung as transportation planners and people thinking about equitable TOD and delivering it by our erroneous view of real estate development and how it happens. How is it that real estate development happens? How is it that transit, therefore, plays a role in that process? And I'm not the first to say this. In one of the sort of seminal works on this topic, back in 1975 and 76, Knight and Trigg were working on a project to better understand the impacts of transit on land use, and they were struck by the extreme lack of knowledge on the part of transit planners about how real estate works. So I'm now, very briefly, going to teach you how real estate development works. Okay, let me check the clock. We're good. All right. So this is going to be sort of Urban Economics 101 from the real estate lens. Let's start with the necessary but insufficient factors that must be in place for real estate development to occur. We need to have policies that allow real estate development to occur. So if you are planning a transportation project, a highway or a transit project or any facility, and you anticipate development happening, it has to be allowed by public policy, maybe even fostered. There has to be a market for it. There has to be a group of individuals willing to pay to be in this building. Let's call it a product for the remainder of this conversation. There has to be a group of people willing to buy this product so that you can pay for the construction of this product. There needs to be sufficient market. There needs to be sufficient capital. All right, so when you build a building, you don't get all your money at once. People pay rent over time. And so what you need is someone to provide money for you up front, both in the form of capital and debt and equity, to build it on the front end, and then you receive payments over time. Okay? And so we need interested parties, people with money, firms with money, to come to the table and be available to provide that money if we're going to build a project. And we also need land. We need land that's affordable, given these other factors. It's sufficiently inexpensive that you can build a project. And let me explain that a bit more. With all these things together, development can occur. If any one of these is off kilter or not present, development will not occur. Any one. All are necessary and insufficient. So the next thing I have to impart to you is the distinction between investors and developers. Okay? As transportation planners, we tend to see the world as there is a government source of funds and they pay us, or perhaps there is a user that pays us, and perhaps there's a combination of the two that pays us to deliver something. All right? And generally, they don't expect anything on the back end, right? We build this facility. They don't pay us for it ongoing. That's debatable. Gas taxes, et cetera. But in the world of real estate, we have two groups. We have the developer and the investor. Think of the developer as the person who brings all the people together to make something happen. They bring the contractors and others together. And then they also bring the investor into the deal to deliver the project. Okay, this is as if you're going to build a toll road, and you need an investor to come in to pay for the toll road up front, so you can then lease the toll road to people on a per-use basis. Okay, the developer of the toll road is a firm that knows how to build roads, how to bring investors together. That's the developer's role here in real estate as well. Now, when a project makes money, the first bit of money that it makes, the profit that it makes, generally goes to the investor. Okay? And this is called a waterfall. And this is sort of a generalized structure of a waterfall, but the first tranche goes to the investor, not to the developer. The second tranche is split. And this is an incentive, to align incentives. The investor wants the developer to do a good job, so they'll give them a little bit of money if you make a certain amount of money. I need you to make enough money so that I'm guaranteed to get this, and I'm hopeful for this. And then if you increase returns considerably, what you'll find is that they want to incentivize that. The investors will give the developers a lot of money. And investors are out investing in lots of things. Pork bellies, or real estate projects. And so there's a certain return required for them to be interested in the investment. There's a certain return required from a toll road for an investor to be interested in investing in a toll road. And sort of there's a band where an investor would be willing to invest in a project that provided a level of return somewhere in this band. But what you find with, unlike transportation, what you find with real estate development is that there's competition to provide something. There's not one state DOT that has a monopoly on providing roads. There are many developers seeking to buy land. Those developers compete for the land. And then there are many investors seeking out developers to partner with to get a return on their investment. And they compete. And in a perfectly competitive environment, what we would expect is that the investors are going to lower their return expectations to the point where the developer that they partner with can win the competition for the land to build a building. So what you find is that generally the developer that's able to buy the land and build the building had found the equity that was the cheapest. They were willing to settle for the least return on their investment. So they said, how well will this project do? You anticipate it will provide a certain minimum return. Let's go forward. And instead of paying me, the investor, a lot of money, go spend more money on the land and win that bid. All right, so there's that trade-off. If you have to pay the investor more, you don't have as much money to pay for the land, therefore you lose the bidding process. If you want to build the building, you have to pay the most for the land. So generally, we sort of see this minimum threshold. This is the amount of money that's required for the investor. And so let's talk about this land price. So we can calculate what the return requirement is for the investor from a particular real estate development project. We can calculate how much it's going to cost to construct it. We can calculate how much you're going to have to pay the bank to get the money. This is the same calculus that goes into building a toll road or anything like that. You also have to pay the people to operate it, to advertise, to market this facility for people to use. And this development has to pay each of these a certain amount of money. And after paying a certain amount of money, there's a certain amount of money left over to buy the land. So that's that trade-off I was describing. If you pay the investor more, then you have less money for the land. You lose the bidding process. So we call this the residual land value. So after you paid everything else, there's a residual left over. And that's this amount of money. So let's put this into practice. We have a y-axis here, which is that residual land value. And we have the x-axis here, which is market rent. So imagine we're in Portland, and there are a lot of different markets in Portland, and people are willing to pay different amounts in different markets. So we have, at the far left here, a market where people are willing to pay $2.50 to live in an apartment. This is $2.50 per square foot, all the way up to $4. And this is generally the band for where development is occurring in Portland right now. And so let's imagine a tower being built. This building, let's go out as a developer of towers. Say I'm a developer and I can only build towers. It's the only thing I know how to build. And I go out to all the markets in Portland. In markets where there is a low willingness to pay on the part of tenants, let's call it low, but it's actually quite high, $2.50. This developer of towers has negative $200 per square foot to spend on land. All right, that means that they do not have any money left over to pay for land. In fact, they need a subsidy of $200 per square foot to even begin thinking about building a building. And this arrow here in the center around $2.90 is the point at which if someone walked up to this tower developer and said, I will give you land for free, please build the building, they would be willing to do so. And anywhere north of this, or to the right of this, any market where people are willing to pay more, the tower developer is able to start to compete for land. Now this is important because land generally isn't just sitting around empty in our cities, particularly near transit. There are things on the land. So the developer of a tower has to go and offer the owner of a 7-Eleven enough money for the 7-Eleven owner to say, I will part with my 7-Eleven and allow you to tear it down and build your tower. So the developer has to have some money to basically displace existing land uses. We've got to be in markets that are here to the right for there to be any money left over to displace the existing land use near a transit station. Let's add sort of the prototypical transit-oriented development typology, which we see a lot in Portland. Sort of a mixed-use product. We call it a 4/1 podium because there are 4 stories of housing over a podium where you have parking or retail. And this is a cheaper product to build. So the developer of a 4/1 podium has lower construction costs than that of a tower. And that's just because of the nature of concrete and steel and wood. And what you see here in the red line is that now, if someone came along and said, I'll give you the land for free in a market where people are willing to pay $2.70 to build, to occupy a house, an apartment, this developer of 4/1 would go ahead. They would build it. But this point right here is very important. Because if these two developers show up to the same piece of land owned by the 7-Eleven owner, let's say, and they say to the 7-Eleven owner, I am willing to buy your land, and the rent is something like $3.60, they will make the same exact offer on the land. But if that 7-Eleven is located in a place that's upmarket from that, say that people are willing to pay $4 a square feet to live in the location near transit where that 7-Eleven is located, the tower developer wins the bidding process, and you see a tower built. Anything below this price point, and you see the red line, is greater than the blue line, and the developer of the podium will win the bidding process. I see a question. Yes?
Is that only because of the floor area ratio, or is that
mainly
just the number of units per?
It's mainly being driven by the scale and the construction costs. Yep. Well, I'll give you another example of a very different type of building. So, stacked flats. This is a type of building that you would see here sort of in the suburbs. It's surface parked. It has no elevators. It's exterior, interior stairs. And a stacked flat product can be built without concrete or steel with just wood. It's relatively inexpensive. This green line represents how much a developer that knows only how to build stacked flats is willing to pay in any given market. And you can see there's a new point in this curve. So to the left of that new arrow, the stacked flat developer wins every time. They go out to the 7-Eleven owner and they say, I'm next to transit. I want to build this. And I can outbid the 4/1 and the tower. All right? That's the green line here on the left-hand side. What does this mean for Portland? Let's lay this out geographically. The dark green represents the areas in Portland that a few months ago when we pulled data on this, these areas had rents sufficient, in other words, far enough to the right, that you could build stack flats. All right, that's the dark green. The rest of the area we're talking about more single family or other typologies, but we're just using 3 typologies for this example. Here, 4/1 podium is what you can build. Okay, 4/1 podium is a smaller land area where people are willing to pay to live in an apartment at a rate where you can build the 4/1 podium. And here's the even smaller area where people are willing to pay enough in rent that a tower could be built. And you'll see that this pattern sort of, it's got a center. It's reflecting agglomerative economies. We want to be clustered around others and around amenities and around things that are centralized. They're co-located in the center. So this has nothing to do with zoning. This is the economics of how cities get built. We see the taller buildings built in the center, and then as we go out, buildings get lower. This is the economics of development. What's important for us when we're talking about transit-oriented development, and we're talking about maybe where do we build the transit investment, where do we focus our efforts when we want equitable TOD to occur, is let's pick a point in space. I just happen to pick somewhere near the 42nd station on the Banfield line. This is Hollywood here in Portland. Let's think about this location in space next to a transit station. And let's assume there's a 7-Eleven there, though I don't think there is. Right away, we see that this green exists here and that we can build stack flats. The developer of the stack flats can show up. Oh, and I forgot to caveat this. This map is based on a developer being offered the land for $0. This is the best case scenario. Oh, I'm sorry. That was an important caveat to throw out. This is the best case scenario. Let's say that PDC, the Portland Development Commission, the redevelopment agency of Portland, shows up and says, developers, we would like to give away land for free in this location. Tell us what you can build. If they did that in this location, of the 3 that we're testing here in this map, you could build stack flats. But you could not, the developer would not voluntarily build the 4/1 podium because they couldn't pay their contractors. They couldn't pay their equity investors. They couldn't pay everyone and actually get the return on investment. They could not attract the bank capital that they needed to build the building in the first place. So they would not be able to build here. And they certainly wouldn't be able to build a residential tower here. All right. But these are TOD. This is the chart again, and I want to show you what this orange dot looks like on the chart. At this orange dot, basically we're saying that we're in a location where the rents are sort of in this band on the x-axis. So if you look at stack flats, stack flat developer shows up and says, I can pay $120 per square foot for the land underneath your 7-Eleven. Are you willing to sell? The 4/1 developer shows up and says, I can pay $20 per square foot for the land under your 7-Eleven. Are you willing to sell? And then we have the tower developer who walks in very slowly and glumly and sad and says, I would need you to pay me $200 or $100 a square foot to tear down your 7-Eleven. Are you willing to pay me $100? And they would probably walk out sadder than they walked in. All right. What's interesting is that we are, we're a group here of transportation folks, but if people want TOD to be built around their transit stations, and land use planners create policies that require that, for example, having ground floor retail, there's no ground floor retail in the stack flats. It may not be allowed. The only thing that may be allowed is the 4/1 podium, in which case this allowed development is the only one who walks in to the 7-Eleven with an offer, and they say, I've got $20 to spend per square foot of land. And the 7-Eleven owner says, well, I make $1 million a year off of my 7-Eleven, and so this isn't going to cut it. I'm going to keep operating my 7-Eleven. So no thank you. Question?
Bruno Di Toledo. I just curious, does every 7-Eleven owner have a price? How hard is this phase of the negotiation usually?
No, they generally don't, unless they put it up for sale, in which case they're probably working with a broker who has done a residual land value analysis, has looked at comparable sales, and informs them that your 7-Eleven, that to you is worth $1 million a year because of the number of things that you sell, to a developer is worth $20 times X number of square feet, and they tell them that. And so there's an information asymmetry. But when there's a competitive bid, so it's listed for sale, or they actually, the 7-Eleven owner goes out and solicits bids, they're going to want competition. They're going to want more than one developer, to offer money so that they know what the value is. All right. So now I'm at the point where I can talk about the topic of the day, which is really, we're pretty far in, and now I'm going to get to the topic of the day, which is equitable TOD. Because thus far we've been talking about developments where there's really no guarantee that anyone of any income could live there. Only people willing to pay this high dollar value per square foot, $2,000 for a 2-bedroom. Only people with the ability and willingness to pay $2,000 for a 2-bedroom can live in one of these 4/1s in this location, for example. What we want is for many people to live here, a diverse array of people, including those with lower incomes who do not have the ability to pay that amount. So what we can do is talk about building that affordability into the building. In other words, let's say that we are going to make some of these buildings have affordable housing inside them. Some portion of them will be affordable housing. Okay? Well, what does that do to this chart? I am now saying some of these units have to be rented out for less than what the market is. Some of these units have to be rented to people who make less than the average income earner in Portland. They move to the left, move down. They tilt even. So this is measuring the impact of including affordable housing. 1/5 of all the units would have to be affordable in these 3 different prototypes, to people who make only 80% of the average or the area median income. This is actually the policy that's on the table right now for inclusionary housing in the city of Portland, this rate. And you can see that what happens with this inclusion is that we shift to the right what market rents have to be for different buildings to be built. In other words, the break point between building stacked flats and building something more dense like 4/1 just moved up in the market. We can only do it in places where people are willing to pay more. So we're either going to ask people to start paying more, which suggests that developers weren't doing their job or property managers weren't doing their job very well before, right? You would expect that the market rent that's there today is the highest that someone could charge in the market if the property is managed well. Or what we're saying is this: the map changes. In certain places where people are willing to pay a certain amount to live in housing, we are no longer able to build certain things. So the dark purple here, these are places where developers showing up to build towers now lose the bid to the developer who showed up to build 4/1. They used to win. They used to build towers. Now they build the 4/1. The blue are places where the developer who built 4/1 used to show up and win and build that. And instead, now, the developer of stacked flats shows up. Note that this is the center of the city. This is sort of part of our centers and corridors concept here in Portland, that we want high density in our centers and corridors. This is the area that would be affected by this in this example. Everywhere would be affected. Let me give you the example that we were using before of Hollywood. In Hollywood, remember those lines before? The stacked flat developer could pay 120, the 4/1 developer could pay 20, and the tower developer needed a subsidy. Well, under this new paradigm, where we are making this an equitable TOD project being delivered by market mechanisms, our common, typical, profit-seeking developer and investor, what we now see is that the stacked flat developer shows up and offers $50 to the 7-Eleven owner instead of 120. Now, the developer of the podium shows up and needs a subsidy. This is sort of our threshold for TOD-ness. We want this high density. We want the ground floor retail. We need a subsidy to build it. And again, with the tower. So that's why when we talk about transit-oriented development around transit, and if you end up working in a transit agency, you will hear this a lot. We need subsidies. I'm coming to you and asking you for subsidies because I'm a developer and I want to build here because it's the right thing to do. I want to build near transit, but I need a subsidy to do it. To build this 4/1 podium or this residential tower, particularly an equitable, a project that includes affordable housing within it, I need a subsidy. And I'll go to the transit agency, to the land use officials. I'll go anywhere I can to find the subsidies so that I could offer the 7-Eleven owner enough money to build the project. The subsidies, or the incentives, because it's a package of incentives, they're not all subsidies, come in several forms. They're sort of direct subsidies. This is money that you hand the developer on day one so that they can go buy the land and build. There's operating subsidies. This is what you would give the developer, the property owner, over time, and you would say, rent the units out for less, and we will give you some money to make up for that. Now go offer the 7-Eleven owner enough to build it. These are just dollars, and there are too few dollars in the world. There's just not enough money to build a lot of equitable TOD through these mechanisms. And then there are another set of incentives, and we tend to think of these as costless policy-based incentives. So one example that's very common is the notion of offering developers density bonuses. That means you can build this much today, but if you provide affordable housing within the project, you can build this much. But I think you'll see that I've just shown you that building more isn't always necessarily better. In many cases it is. But building more is not always necessarily better. And so density bonus, while written in the code, may have zero or negative value. Not negative, because you can always opt not to take it. But then you don't deliver the equitable TOD that we want. Then there's this one that touches on transportation and on TOD-ness considerably, which is parking ratios. You could say to developers, you must provide a certain number of parking stalls, but if you would provide affordable housing within your development, we would reduce the number of parking stalls you have to build. And parking stalls are expensive. In a building like this one, the parking stalls might be on the order of $30,000, $35,000 per parking stall. So if you can build half as many, that's more money you free up to pay the 7-Eleven owner. For a residential tower with parking that's underground, we're talking about $45,000 to build a parking stall. So if you can build less of them, you have more money to pay the 7-Eleven owner. The problem for us as transportation professionals is that what's happening there is that the land use authority, who grants the rights to build buildings, is saying, we would like you to build more parking than you needed. And then we'll let you build less. Which, if you're willing to do that as a developer, it means you were willing to build less anyway. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it. So that means that there's a built-in requirement. There's a slush fund of parking that was unnecessarily being required in the building, which means people were paying for that parking. It means that people had ready access to a parking space, which means they might drive more, which means that they might not ride transit or walk or bike or achieve any of the other transportation goals that we have associated with transit-oriented development. So if we have a parking reduction as an incentive, it's a signal that we perhaps are doing the wrong thing from a transportation standpoint. This is complex, and so let me go back to this project, and let me explain it in sort of simple terms. Today, a typical development will occur where a developer goes and asks for an equity investor to provide 20 to 50% of the cost of building the building, and they'll go get a loan for the rest. Somewhere between 80 and 50% will come from a loan from a bank. This project is a $69 million project, and it's sort of taking out the 10 years of planning, the incredible amount of time and energy and money spent in preparing for this. $69 million. It had $19 million in debt and $50 million in equity. The equity was never going to be repaid enough to attract the type of competitive equity I was describing before. The equity came from sources that granted the equity. The federal government, the city, the region, I believe even BART contributed equity to this project. It required zero return for the most part. Projects like this don't happen in the capitalist housing delivery system that exists today. This is a very rare and beautiful species of development, and it's even more rare, and it's also a rare and beautiful species of transit-oriented development. It's very uncommon, and I think I tried to just explain why. It does not fit the model that dominates our systems. This is a long slide that says we should consider institutions. All right. We need to know about institutions and how they function because they inform the outcomes. And we want to change the outcomes. I've been talking to you thus far about the dominant system that we have to deliver housing, the market-based system of home builders, multifamily firms, and infill developers that are trying to profit off of developing housing and mixed-use development. And I've also mentioned support systems for them. That Fruitvale Transit Village, tons of support systems. In Portland, some of our support systems to encourage the market to deliver housing where we want it and of the type, the equity component that we want, comes from places like the Portland Development Commission, our multiple unit tax exemption, and from Metro, our regional government that focuses on transportation and also on land use, gives money specifically to tie the two together. They give money to developers. They buy land to then sell that to developers to deliver projects near transit. And then there are parallel systems, like the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. And we are in conversations right now. Wyden has come forward with a middle-income housing tax credit back in September that would expand a parallel system. This is a system where the equity in projects doesn't seek a return. LIHTC comes from the U.S. Treasury. Low-income housing tax credits is a form of financing for projects where the federal government says, we'll give tax breaks to institutions that are willing to buy them. And when they buy them, we'll take the money that they pay and we'll put it into low-income housing. And Wyden has proposed an expansion of this program. Now, we also have programs being proposed to address equitable TOD, like inclusionary housing and rent control and other things percolating, which I've shown would contract the supply of housing from the dominant profit-seeking housing supply system. All right? Fewer places, smaller buildings is what I showed you. Which means we need a commensurate increase in the support systems if we want to keep the supply coming and we want it to be equitable. How do we increase the support systems? Well, we have just passed a wonderful support system. Right? The housing bond was just passed. The question then becomes, will this funding be targeted to location-efficient places near transit? Will it be somehow funneled towards these places that offer these transportation plus amenity and housing benefits? What about parallel systems? Can we refocus our parallel systems on E-TOD? I did a study with Miriam Zook at UC Berkeley, and Miriam was looking at low-income housing tax credit projects, and we layered on transit. And what we found is that you have these transit stations, and about less than 5% of all the low-income housing tax credit projects funded in the United States and currently operating are within a quarter mile of transit. And about 15% are within a half mile of transit. That's not very many. And then we look at new transit facilities that are being built, new transit stations. About 50%, a little over 50% of new transit stations are being built near low-income housing tax credit projects. And about 20% of those new stations saw low-income housing tax credit projects built after the fact. But what's more interesting with equitable TOD is what about where they're located relative to other things? Like, are we locating these in low-income areas or higher-income areas? Are we creating diverse places? We found that about 70% of transit-served low-income housing tax credit projects are in higher-income areas, in large part because we funnel low-income housing tax credits to projects located in these areas. What about school districts? All right, that defines place as well, and it also defines opportunity of the residents. Well, we found about 55% of transit-served low-income housing tax credit projects were located in good school districts. The problem is, what about this little unicorn right here that's located in the good school district, high-income area, transit, and was built since the transit opened? In other words, it was new. It wasn't sort of the act of the transit agency doing it. It was developers delivering product near transit. We tried to go find case studies to carry out case studies, and our analysis found that there were only 5 projects in the United States out of 34,791 that met this criteria. What we can do is states can change how they allocate the low-income housing tax credits, and many are doing that to focus more on transit-served areas. This is sort of this is a map showing you states where the transit proximity is a factor in how low-income housing tax credits are allocated. You can see that Oregon's in one of the light colored. There's been activity on this since this study was done, but this light color suggests that Oregon is sort of, it's on the map, but it's behind the curve. There's more that could be done to focus low-income housing tax credit allocation to places where there's transit and opportunity. I want to also talk about creating another parallel system through transportation. I've come full circle for all of you. How do we do this through transportation? This is my map of how to do it. A spectrum from the least integration between transportation and land use, and equitable TOD in particular, and the most integration between transportation and land use. Green indicates that we are doing this today. Red is something that we're not yet doing in the United States. And I've divided up these actions into sort of things that accommodate equitable TOD, things that are actually support systems for equitable TOD, and those that create parallel systems for equitable TOD. Let's talk about the green. We do this already. We make equitable TOD a consideration of all the transit planners. You now have to do this. My concern is that in studies that I've done on how transit planners think about real estate, they make a lot of moves, a lot of design decisions focused on TOD, but not necessarily based on the best understanding of how real estate development occurs. So it may not be very effective. Let's go up to this hatched one here. Equitable transit-oriented development planning is part of transit planning. Well, we're doing that right here in Portland. In part because a few years ago, the federal government included affordable housing as a criteria for winning transit funding. Transit projects compete for federal funds, and those people applying for it must fill out an application form that includes information about affordable housing, which means agencies that are progressive, like Metro, are doing their planning of, for example, the Southwest Corridor or the Powell Division with equitable TOD in mind. Not just to score well, but because it's the right thing to do. And then we have the red spectrum of things we could do. The first thing is reward agencies on their outcomes. Transit agencies could design projects and be rewarded, get more funding more often from the federal government if they achieve the equitable TOD outcomes. But to do that, we'd have to actually measure TOD outcomes. Right now, after your transit project is done, you only measure ridership and operating costs, but not land use outcomes. And every ex post evaluation that I have read, if there was a ridership shortfall, it was blamed on the lack of new TOD that happened, which is ironic. We need to perhaps set targets and measure whether you achieved it, got less, or got more, and allocate funding that way, perhaps. And then the far red. This is perhaps what has been advocated for 30, 40 years by many people in the transportation and land use integration realm, which is to be more like places like Asia, city-states in Asia, where transit agencies actually deliver land to housing developers. They actually may even build housing. And that housing is often equitable, right? City-states are doing this every day. Transit agencies are, this is part of their portfolio, part of their activity. So to conclude and leave only 5 minutes for questions, the market is not delivering TOD, and especially not E-TOD, and I am arguing it's because our predominant system for delivering housing is not sufficient, and that we can reorient some of our other institutions, including, I'll go back, including transportation planners and transportation agencies to deliver this, which means this may become a part of your portfolio for those of you in the room. Over time, as we creep more and more to the north here, you're going to need to know more and more about real estate development and, in particular, equitable real estate development. So thanks.
I'm Jaime. So the thing is that in your analysis, when you put like the red achieve, you are assuming that it's a constant in time. For example, if you look at Portland, I think that the last year the rent has slowed like 10%. So usually real estate development takes more than a year. So that's the thing about the dynamic prices of rent. And then I'm thinking about if you have like all these supportive systems, how you are not like subsidizing the profit of the construct and the real estate development rather than achieving the objective that is like affordable housing.
The first one's easier, so I'll start with that one. The underwriting of real estate projects is forward-looking. It anticipates what's going to happen. And if a sound argument can be made that rents are going to be higher, then that will appear in the underwriting, in large part because the developer has every incentive to argue for that so they can get more equity and more debt from their lenders and their equity investors, which means they put less into the project, which means they're more likely to pay the 7-Eleven owner enough to build it. Second question is, how do you do that? In other countries, it's done through open book, very transparent negotiations where the underwriting is carried out face-to-face between land use planners and others with the developers. And everyone knows what's going on. Here, that's not the case, except in certain circumstances. For example, when a transit agency might be working directly with the developer to build something on a former parking lot, or PDC negotiating with the developer to build something. And in those cases, you can really try to narrow the gap. In other words, capture as much of the value for equity and for other design elements that you want versus it going into the pockets of the investors and the developers. However, in the open market, it's more difficult. And when we design policies that are sort of one-size-fits-all, it doesn't work very well. In some places, we are designing the policy so that there might be a little bit more meat on the bone, and in other places, we're designing it so that we've actually crippled the market, and we're influencing the market through the policies. So hopefully that answers your question. It's not an exact science when folks are making these policies.
Joe from the classes. Quite often these developments are even banned by zoning. The zoning will, I know you had some stars up there from Minneapolis along one of the recent things that they had. They banned anything over 3 floors around station areas. So suddenly you're trying to get 2 over 1 instead of 4 over 1. And I'm just wondering, when you put such harsh restrictions on any size whatsoever, are you essentially giving up on ground floor, or is it essentially a trade-off of ground floor retail or equitable, and it cannot be both without massive subsidy?
Yes, yes, yes. So you're basically changing the lines and which lines compete, right, for that land. And the bigger problem, I think, with a lot of those, and why we don't see development in those cases, is go back to the 7-Eleven owner. You've now prescribed what can be built, and the maximum that can be built may not be enough to displace the 7-Eleven owner. They don't have enough money to pay the 7-Eleven owner unless you give them a lot of subsidies or something like that. So yes, that constraint. But also there's just the natural market constraint. Let's not forget, there may be these policies around transit stations that say you can't build more than 3 stories, but it was the stacked flat developer that was going to build there anyway. We may have wanted the 4 over 1 to be built there, but it may have needed subsidy even before the zoning code was constrained it, for example, using your example. So it's not, again, it's contextual and it's not one size fits all. It depends.
Hi, yeah, so my question was, I kind of developed it just before you started talking about the subsidies for the low-income housing. I was just curious if you thought that developing a city on subsidies, like saying that development isn't even profitable without these subsidies, if you think that's a correct method for building development.
You're going to get really normative here. My answer is embedded in this presentation, which is that the market will not provide for certain bands, both geographically and also individuals with a willingness to pay and an ability to pay that is below what the market will provide. If you want housing for that group of individuals with a lower ability to pay, and you want it to be in certain places, or you can treat those as separate, you want either or, the market will not provide it, and therefore you need something in the form of subsidies. Or you need the public, don't think of it as subsidies, the public could build housing, right? We had that before. That's still present all over the world, where the public sector dedicates some of its tax resources to building housing for part of its population because the market fundamentally won't do it. And that's just a reality of the market system. Yeah?
I just had a kind of quick, I don't know if it's a quick question, but about, it seems like one of the core things you're kind of trying to communicate is how people, transportation planners or people in transportation, people in real estate, and people in housing aren't really communicating very well and working together very well. So I don't know if any of the projects that you've studied specifically between real estate and transportation, what are some of the challenges or ways that they've been able to do that a little bit better?
Yeah. There are a number of case studies out there about this, but projects that I've worked on oftentimes are those that are sort of at the forefront of transportation and land use integration. It's organizations that have heard of it and then hire consultants to help on it. Those often are organizations that are working collaboratively on the topic. Portland's full of this, where land use planners, economic development officials, and transit planners are collaborating on the design of facilities. They're collaborating on where to allocate funding for affordable housing. And I think those models are out there. They're a bit too far and few of them, because traditionally the money that comes into transportation is awfully siloed, and it's not necessary and it's not required that transportation planners actually collaborate to get projects built, to take in federal funds and deploy it in a capital investment. I think that's changing. At least a few weeks ago, I would have said I guarantee it's changing. The world is heading towards a greater integration of transportation and land use, and I wish I could have spent more time on those last slides where that spectrum, that continuum, we keep marching up it. And the rest of the world, not all of it, but many places in the world, they're already there. But we keep marching up, where there's going to be more and more collaboration, and transportation planners are going to be more integrated into the urban development system. It's a system. They act together. I think we're done.
And let's thank Dr. Carlton.